I have a question for you. How do you recognize a good Substance Designer graph? Is it A, that it has very few nodes? Or is it B, that all the nodes are incredibly well named and described? Or is it C, that even after a year you still can find your way through the graph even if it's very complicated? If you guessed A or B, you're in for a surprise today. And with that, hello and welcome. About a year ago, I posted a showcase video of a substance material I've made, and 2 people have asked me to break it down and explain my creation process. Shoutouts to Eclipse and Taito Shako at this point. Now, I haven't really visited this graph in quite a while, and first of all, I would like to go over why I created this material and how it can be used. I'm going to showcase some of the parameters again, which I already did in my very short breakdown, and then I will go over the graph and show you how I've created it. And in the end, I will give a brief demonstration inside the Unreal Engine on how this material can be used. Okay, let's jump right into it. We're inside of Substance Player right now, and let me talk about why I've created this material first. This is being used in a game project that I'm currently working on inside of the Unreal Engine, and this is supposed to be used for texturing a modular wall set. So I had to create a very basic looking concrete material with little variation, so that any kind of repetition wouldn't be too visible. I've created some parameters which allow me to break up the material and make it look more interesting, and I'm gonna export several versions of this material into the Unreal Engine and blend them together with vertex painting. I can also add some decals on top, but let's just focus on this material. Okay, as you can see, I have 5 different groups right here. The bottom 3 groups are simply there to regulate some physical parameters. They could be used inside of Substance Painter, for instance. You got your base color, the normal map, and the roughness. Of course, there are certain filters inside of Substance Painter to tweak these values. However, I found this way to be much more efficient and much faster. And also you can customize more. Okay, the top 2 layers actually alter the physical appearance of the material. I have my damage group and my extra group. Now, let's generate some wear. As you can see, I have the slider, and the more I turn it up, the bigger the wear level gets. And as you can see, this material consists of 2 different layers, and I'm using a mask to blend between them. Now, in addition to the wear level, I can also add some small cracks. I can make these cracks thicker. And if I really want to get some destruction going, I can also add some big cracks. Of course, all of these parameters can be used in conjunction with one another to create a more interesting look. Okay, that's pretty much it for the damage group. As you can see, this blends between my 2 layers. And I also have an extra group, and this extra group allows me to add a few more things and also customize some existing parts of this material. For instance, if you look at this material from close up, you can see that I have these small divots. I can make these divots bigger. I can make them really big, and I can also change their amount. Now, the only limitation to this is that if I turn the amount all the way down, they get gigantic, and it doesn't look very good. So I also have to tweak the scale in combination with the amount. Okay, let's get this back to the default value. And on top of this basic layer, I can also add some water spots. I've created 3 different variations for them. I have these average looking weak ones. I have horizontal water spots. And these horizontal water spots can also have a cavity. Now, as you can see, I have 2 different parameters for that. I'm gonna show you how they work inside of Substance Designer later. I have this toggle, which basically just tells the program whether there is a cavity or not. And I also have this strength. If I turn it up, you can see the material's normal map is being altered. Just a little bit, but it's visible. Okay, and last but not least, I also have these vertical water spots. Now, the last two parameters are only affecting the bottom layer, so I have to turn my wear level up again. And as you can see, I have these small dark rocks on the bottom. Again, I can change their amount and I can change their scale. So I can change a lot of things about this material and achieve a lot of different looks. Now, to finish things up, I would also like to talk about the way I've used these physical parameters. I've made it so I could customize every layer individually. So I have this top layer parameters and the damage layer parameters. And I also have a luminosity parameter for the water spots. You can't really change the hue and the saturation because they're simply grayscale. And I wouldn't want the material to be as broken. You technically can break the material by changing the hues of the individual layers too much, but why would you do that? So I've just left everything unlocked, and I can alter the appearance of the material in general by using these master sliders. Okay, I've done something similar for the roughness, except that I didn't make it as advanced simply because it wasn't necessary. I've been playing around with these, but they turned out to be fine the way they are. And I have this slider for the normal map intensity. Again, you can turn it up and you can turn it all the way down, even though that would look broken. But why would anyone change that to something other than a reasonable value? Okay, that is pretty much it for the breakdown, and we're gonna jump right into Substance Designer. Okay, so now we're inside of Substance Designer. And when I zoom out, you will see that this graph looks like quite the monster. However, it's actually really simple. I'm gonna go over how I've created the different groups here. And as you can see, I've kept everything neat and organized. So even after some time of not interacting with this graph whatsoever, I'm still able to find my way around. Okay, the way I created this graph is that I first created the height and the normal map. Then I created the roughness and the ambient occlusion, and in the end I created the base color. In the beginning, all of these upper groups, everything that is above the small divots, was not planned, and all the water spots were added in after the material was pretty much done, because I felt that it was a neat idea to do. And I've basically created this base pattern first, as you can see here in this upper group. After that, I created the damage pattern, which is everything you see when I activate the wear level. And these three groups, the damage mask, the small cracks pattern, and the big cracks pattern, are actually just masks. Now, as you can see, I have these two groups in the middle here, and that is basically what drives everything else. This damage pattern mask is pretty much my master mask. That is where all the outputs from the groups down here go in. And this is where I've finalized the base pattern. As you can see, from there on out, it goes into my final outputs, and there are some adjustments on the right. Now, I did alter this material a bit. In the very beginning, my height and my normal map were pretty much the same. However, I've changed this a bit, and if I activate my tessellation, you'll be able to see. I've basically disabled most of the height maps feature, except the blend between the wear level and the base pattern. So if I activate the wear level and I turn it a bit up, you will see this is still in my height map. And the reason I did this is that when I use this material inside of Substance Painter, I actually get some nice shading here. This material was originally created for a modular wall system, and I don't really use a height map in the Unreal Engine in this case, so when I export these textures, the height map isn't being used at all. Okay, let's get started with my base pattern. The base pattern is everything you see here. It doesn't look very spectacular. As I have said, I wanted to make it as basic as possible with a big tileability factor. And the way I created this is by pretty much blending several noises together. Down here I have a clouds 2 noise and a moisture noise. I blended them. This levels node in here I created because in case I wanted to adjust something later on, I could easily do it. However, it turned out to be unnecessary. I've done similar things later on, so I often have these levels nodes in here just in case I want to tweak something. After that I blurred my noise and then I blended it. However, I also created 2 variations of this noise. One where the whites are turned up quite a bit and one where it's inverted. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to use these noises as masks. As you can see here, I have several blends. This one here is a directional noise which have some of its black parts removed, and I blended this on top of my directional blur. As you can see, there are these white grainy parts, and the mask for that is the inverted directional blur node after I applied the levels. Now I've created another pattern by creating a shape node which I put into a tile generator. As you can see, I have some luminance and scale variation here, and in the end I warped it to make the dots look a bit elongated and not as uniform. After that I made the dots darker and I blended them over this black and white spots 2 noise. As you can see, there are these little white dots here, and my blending mode is screen. So in case you don't know, the screen blending mode removes all the black parts from your foreground layer. Now I've blended the 2 noises together and my mask is the level directional blur. If I zoom out here, you'll be able to see that I still have quite a lot of detail here, and if I activate my tiling you will see that it's actually quite obvious. Now if I remove this levels node, you will also see a bit of the roughness going up, and I didn't want this, so I also decreased the contrast. It's still a bit visible, but not as much. After I was done with the basic pattern, I added those small divots on top, and I just used a very basic shape node. I put it into a tile generator, and I didn't want the divots to appear everywhere because, as you can see, it's just too much and it doesn't look so good. So I used this blend node and I just masked out some of the parts with a cloud noise. I increased the white so that I have a better mask, and I just masked out some of the tile generated shapes. In the end I inverted it because I wanted the divots to be subtracted from my basic pattern, and I used the multiply blend mode and I blended the base pattern and my divots right here. Now as you can see, I have some connections going out there. The first one is gonna go into my base color, the second one is gonna go into this levels node, and the third node is gonna drive my ambient occlusion. I'm gonna talk about my final outputs later, so let's not worry too much about all of that, and I'm gonna talk about the damage pattern next. Okay, now it's time to talk about the damage pattern, and in order to do that, let me first change something about my material. I'm gonna turn the wear level all the way up to 1, so you can actually see the damage pattern, and you can see that it's this grainy bottom and the little rocks. Now, in order to create the actual damage pattern, again I used the black and white spots 2 noise, and I blended some I blended a shape over it which I put into a tile generator, and this shape is actually this those little white dots that you can see here. I can take them out and they're being generated by this shape. Again, I put them into a tile generator. There's not much to it except for some luminance variation, and I blended them with the screen blending mode on top of the black and white spots 2 noise. I then went on and decreased the contrast, and let me just pull this out a bit here so you can see the connections. After that, I blended the rocks over. And I did this by using a shape again and a clouds 1 noise, which I used to make the shape a bit more grainy. And I put the shape into a tile generator. Now this tile generator acts as both the shape of the rocks and the mask. Now, before using it as a mask, I also increased the contrast quite a bit, the whites, and I put it into a blend node and I blended the rocks on top of the noise. I also used another levels node, which you can see here. It's going up to be my base color, and I will talk about those final outputs in the very end. Just have a small look at those nodes. There are a lot of connections going out into the distance. This is where all my final outputs are being generated. Okay, those two are pretty much my final layers for my damage pattern. And that's basically it for my two basic layers. So you can think of this material as being a composite of two smaller materials, and all my parameters are being driven by my masks. Okay, now let's set up this next part. I have to turn the wear level down a bit, but not too much. I think 0.3 is enough. And also let me limit this again, because now we are gonna talk about my masks. Okay, so now that we have our basic patterns, let's talk about the mask. And the masks are pretty much what make up this entire material. I have three masks: the damage mask, the small cracks pattern, and the big cracks pattern. It's pretty obvious what each one does. The damage mask regulates my wear level, and the cracks patterns regulate my cracks, obviously. Now, this is where all of the magic happens. I have two blend nodes, and the blend nodes blend all of these masks together. In the beginning, I've created my simple damage mask, which consists of two polygonal shapes which I've blended together. And my objective was to create a very crisp pattern which is not too grainy. And I'm going to show you how I did that. It's not very spectacular. I just added a lot of warp nodes in between and directional warp nodes. I also tiled this pattern a bit, and then I kept further distorting it with several different noises. Now the problem is, if I use too many warp nodes, you can see that I have these grainy edges right here, and they don't look good in the masks. So I had to blur them a bit. I did this, I believe, once right here. And after I've created these basic patterns for my mask, I put them into this histogram scan node. And what this histogram scan node does is this acts as my parameter for my wear level. So as you can see, I've exposed the position, and that is my wear level parameter. So when I increase or decrease the position of the histogram scan, you'll be able to see right now. When I turn the wear level up and down, you can see the histogram scan node change. I limited it to a factor of 0.4 because I didn't want the wear level to be too big and too messy, because it didn't really look good. I also blurred the mask so that I don't have these grainy edges. And in the end, I put it into this levels node just to make it look a bit sharper and to make the mask work. Okay, I did the same thing with my small cracks and my big cracks pattern. The small cracks consist of a cells 3 noise. I put it into this edge detect, and I exposed the edge width to be my small cracks thickness. I inverted it, and then I wanted to warp it, because as you can see, this basic cells 3 noise looks very straight and non-organic, and by applying this warp node, it just looks better. To use the warp node, you obviously need a gradient input, and I used a simple polygonal shape which I blurred and then put into a tile generator. Then I added this blend node in for the same reason I added the blend node for my small divots. I didn't want the cracks to appear everywhere, so I just used a pure black uniform color and a noise as a mask. So when I turn up my small cracks, you'll be able to see that they look quite organic and they don't appear everywhere the same. As you can see right here, they aren't as deep as, for example, up here. Now, my big cracks pattern resulted from a shape. And again, I did a lot of warping. It's the same that I did with my wear level pattern, because I didn't want the edges to be too grainy. I just used several noises which I transformed in different ways to create this basic shape for the crack. And then I put it into a tile generator, and I also increased the scale a bit, as you can see, the horizontal size, and I scaled down the vertical size to get these, yeah, they almost look like very long scratches. I kept further distorting them, and in the end, again, I blurred it because I didn't want the edges to look too grainy. Now let's turn up my big cracks parameter right here. And I'm also going to turn down my wear level so you can see it better. So it's these long, almost scratch-like cracks. And as you can see, I have another histogram scan node in here. It does the same as the other two. It gives me my parameters. So I used histogram scans all the time to be able to regulate this parameter. That's pretty much it for my pattern masks, and all of them go in here. So my wear level and my small cracks amount go in here, and the result goes into this blend node, and I blended the big cracks over them as well. So that's basically what drives the transition between the upper layer and the lower layer. Okay, let's talk about my output generation. I'm going to talk about the water spots later because I added them in when the material was pretty much done. At first I only created this very simple concrete with the patterns and the masks. So as I've said in the beginning, I created my normal map. And if you look at this normal map group, you'll see these two nodes at the top. I just want you to forget about them because they will relate to my horizontal water spots. This is basically what creates my normal map, especially this node right here. As you can see, my damage pattern mask goes into the opacity input, and my foreground and background input are the results of my base pattern blend and my damage pattern. So as you can see, this damage pattern right here in the end, it goes up into my normal map. And I put those levels nodes in here in case I wanted to tweak something. Now, as I've said, I have my base pattern here, my base pattern blend. I needed to adjust the levels and invert them because when I created my roughness map and my normal map and of course my ambient occlusion, I couldn't use the same node for everything. So I had to vary them a tiny little bit. I did the same thing with my damage pattern, but all of these go into my final outputs. Okay, so as I've said, I'm going to talk about these two nodes up here later, and these two blend nodes also have to do with my water spots. Okay, so let's talk about the roughness. The roughness is probably the simplest setup that you can think about. Again, I have this blend node and I have my two patterns. So as you can see, most of this magic happens right here and with my two basic patterns. I adjusted the roughness a bit, and as you can see, I have two levels nodes up here. The first one is for me in case I wanted to tweak something in Substance Designer, and the second one pretty much doesn't have any changes applied to them except that I exposed the middle part right here. That is going to be my roughness parameter for my base pattern. I did the same thing here. This is the roughness from my wear level, and after I blended these two together, again, they're driven by the masks. I have another levels node, which is going to be my master roughness. Okay, as for the ambient occlusion, I pretty much did the same thing, except that it's a little more complicated this time. I needed to adjust my noises a little bit, because as you can see, if I create this HBAO node and I take a very moderate noise, like for example this Clouds 2 noise, it gets turned all the way up. So there's a lot of grain inside of them, and I needed to adjust them in order to look properly. Okay, so as you can see, I have 2 empty levels nodes in here, just in case I wanted to tweak something later on. And I have these HBAO nodes. I blended them together. Again, my mask is my damage pattern mask. Let me just turn up the wear level again so you can see it. It's being affected by my damage pattern mask. What I did here is I took the blend node from my normal map just because I liked the look of it, and I blended it on top of this node right here. And the reason I did that is because, as you can see, all this noise looks pretty much the same. You have these small darker spots, and by adding the blend node from my normal map, I emphasize the difference between my 2 patterns so that the shadows get much darker down here, and so that it's not as grainy, because I really wanted there to be a very crisp line. Now, if I put this into my ambient occlusion slot, it's gonna look horrible, because everything that's black in this node is also black in here. So I needed to level it down a bit, and I could have used a simple levels node. However, I've decided to use another HBAO node and put the height depth all the way to 0.01. This is something you have to consider when using the HBAO node. You either have to use a very low height depth, or you have to apply a levels node in between. I could have also used another levels node and exposed some parameters to increase or decrease the ambient occlusion levels. However, I didn't find this to be very necessary, especially because I have a master material with the same function inside of the Unreal Engine. Okay, so finally we talk about the base color and my water spots. The base color setup looks quite complicated because I have lots of different base colors blending in, and I wanted to be able to tweak every single of these parameters later in the engine. So I didn't want one slider for everything. I wanted everything to be as customizable as possible. And in the beginning, I only had the base colors for my basic pattern and my damage pattern. If I highlight this part right here, I'm actually just going to select a few nodes. I believe these 2, and I believe this one. As you can see, they all go up here somewhere. And the reason is I gave everything a separate color. For instance, this one is the color of my rocks. This one, I think, is the color of my damage pattern itself. Yes, exactly. And I had to separate them and give them their own gradient map, because I wouldn't have been able to make it work otherwise, because the rocks have an entirely different color. And then I blended them together again. So this blend node here is pretty much comparable to this one down here. The rocks are being blended, oh no, sorry, I meant this one. The rocks are being blended over my damage pattern. In the end, I applied this HSL node, I changed the lightness a little bit, and I have these HSL nodes here which do the same thing, except that they regulate the color individually. In the end, this is the color of my damage pattern, and I put it into this blend node where it's being blended with my base color for the basic pattern, and I have this HSL node with everything exposed. Now, if I go to my parameters, you will see that I'm able to change hue, saturation, and brightness from my damaged layer. Right here, here, and there. That's being done by this HSL node. Now, as for my basic pattern, this is my basic pattern blend. However, I think I need to select this one, because these divots, they don't have such a big color difference, because they're mainly being generated by my AO. And I had to create a simple gradient map for my base color, I use this HSL node. Now this is my base color, hue, saturation, and lightness, which I've also exposed. And what I could have done, or what I could do right now without any visual impact whatsoever, I could just take this and plug it in here. As you can see, nothing happens because these nodes are basically my base color. Now, all of that belongs to my water spots, and I'm gonna talk about them right now. When I was done with my material, I thought, well, I'm gonna put this into the engine, I'm gonna vertex paint all the damage layer on top, and I'm gonna use decals to create the water spots. But then I thought, hey, maybe I can actually implement the water spots right in here. And let me show you real quick. I need to turn down the wear level. I added 3 different variations. The so-called weak water spots, the horizontal ones, and the vertical ones. And I worked from bottom to top here, so I created the weak water spots first. Now, for the weak ones and the vertical ones, you have to bear in mind that they only affect the base color. So I don't really change anything about the roughness, I don't change anything about the ambient occlusion, I only affect the base color, which is happening right in this in these couple of nodes. The horizontal ones also affect the base color, but in addition to that they also affect the normal map because I've added in this cavity. Okay, so let's get to the weak water spots first. I'm gonna turn each one up respectively while I talk about them. And here they are. I'm gonna turn them all the way up. And I started with a simple shape, which I plugged into a tile generator because I want them to look like they're running down these walls. Maybe I need to turn them down again because otherwise you won't be able to see what I mean, apparently, because they're very strong right now. And I can't find them. Okay, here they are. Good. That's the problem when you have lots of parameters. You don't find your stuff in Substance Designer. Maybe I should go to the preview mode from now on. As you can see, they look like they're actually running down the walls. I used this tile generator and I warped them. I have this noise, this moisture noise, which is very fitting for the water spots. And I warped them and I warped them again so that they look very vertical, and that is going to be my pattern for the warp. I used them again as a means of blending, and I used this. I used another warp node right here with a gradient. Like that, I create this nice look of the water spots which run down. Now, same thing with as with the wear pattern. I have a histogram scan node which acts as my parameter, and I have a levels node to increase the strength a bit. Now the horizontal water spots are no different either. I just started in another direction. I have a shape which I blurred a bit and then warped. As you can see, I have this very simple setup right here. I used a gradient again. And after I blended them, I tiled them. So I have these nice horizontal tiles running, and oh my god, this is actually so much better because now I can just add the water spots and find everything. Anyway, I applied some directional warps to make them look a bit more organic, and in the end I did the same thing that I did with my small cracks and my divots. I masked out some parts so they don't run everywhere. I used another levels node and a histogram scan to create the horizontal water spots. Now, as you can see, these two outputs go into my base color, and with these two outputs I control my cavity. I used a simple levels node. This levels node, as you can see, is just a very fancy way of using an invert grayscale. I just inverted the values, I blurred them, and I blended them over my regular normal map. And if I turn my cavity up a bit, you will be able to see. as you can see, something's happening here. Now this blur node goes into the blend, and right here I'm blending this node over the regular normal to make it a bit weaker. And I exposed the opacity right here and right here. The reason I did that is visible if you compare the two blend nodes. Can you see the difference here? It's set to switch and this one's set to multiply. Now this switch node is my opacity, is my horizontal water spots cavity toggle. This one is the strength. So I can turn the opacity up from 0 to 1 with everything in between. That is going to be my strength. And I can have this at either 0 or 1. That is going to be my opacity toggle. And the reason I put this in and I use the switch blend mode is because the switch blend mode makes it easier to switch between values of 0 and 1. This one is better if you want to use something in between. And this goes into my final normal map input. Okay, so there we have the vertical water spots. And let me just get rid of the horizontal ones like that. As you can see, they are a bit more vertical than the weak ones. And I started out with a shape again, which I warped, and I kept blurring it. I'm just gonna go over these nodes very quickly because there's not much to it. I transformed it, and I have this histogram scan node, which doesn't work as a parameter this time, but just to regulate the visibility of my transformation 2D node. And then I tiled it. After I did that, I did the same thing that I did with my other water spots. I kept warping them to give them a nice organic look. And I kept blurring them to not have some crisp edges right here. And I pretty much repeated this process a couple of times just to tweak the look very slightly. In the end, I blended another black color over them to make them a little bit less visible, and I kept blurring them. Now, this histogram scan node, I'm sorry, wait a second. Oh yeah. This histogram scan node is again just for creating the levels, and my parameter rests in here inside of the opacity. This is my water spots visibility because it's blending between my pattern and the uniform black color. So if I turn up the opacity of my of my vertical water spots, you can see that this blend node is the first one that's being altered. Okay, so in the end I applied one last warp node, and I didn't blur it because I actually liked the crispy look right here. I could still tweak the intensity, I could even expose it, but it turned out to be unnecessary. Now if I actually mark these outputs, you will see that they all go into different base colors. And I tweaked them a little bit, and after I have these HSL nodes, I have more HSL nodes where I exposed some parameters, mainly the lightness in this case, because the water spots aren't really supposed to have a color. They're always supposed to be grayscale, and I only need to change the luminosity here. So these are my water spots luminosities. When I talked about the base color, I said that these two nodes are driving my base color of the material itself, and everything in between here is just the water spots. Well, as you see, this is still true. I have my two patterns, and I blended the water spots only on top of the basic pattern here. So I have the base pattern here, the base color of my base pattern, and I blended the water spots on top of them first. And only when I was done, I blended the color of my damage pattern over the base pattern with the water spots. The reason I did that is very obvious, because when I apply some wear, I don't want the water spots to appear on top of the wear level. If I increase it, you can see that the water spots disappear where my damage layer appears. So as you can see, this graph is actually quite simple. I have my different groups and all these groups converge pretty much here. From here on out, it's just my final outputs. Now, if you paid close attention, you see that I also have these two nodes right here. I have an RGBA merge and a uniform color. And the reason I did that is because, as I've said, I wanted to export the tileable material into the Unreal Engine. Now, the Unreal Engine offers you a feature to pack some channels. Mainly all the channels that have the same physical attributes. What that means is basically that I can take 3 maps that are simply grayscale, in this case the roughness, the metallic and the ambient occlusion, and put them into one map, which then looks like it's color, but it's actually not. It's just 3 grayscale channels. I couldn't do the same with my normal map or my base color because they have different physical attributes. The base color is an sRGB map and the normal map has an own category inside the Unreal Engine, so I can't really merge those in. So I just take my ambient occlusion, my roughness and my metallic map, and I take these final outputs. I have my final output from the HBAO, so it's the same one that goes into my ambient occlusion slot. This goes into the R channel. My roughness goes into the R channel, the G channel, and my black uniform color goes into the B channel. Obviously my material is not metallic, so I have a simple uniform color in here. If it was a metal, of course, it would look differently. And in the end, I need a mask for my alpha, which is a simple uniform color. And when I export these maps into the Unreal Engine, I just take my base color, my normal and my combined map and export them. Now, I would like to give you a small demonstration of how I can use this material in the engine. Now I have imported several versions of my material into the Unreal Engine. I'm using a very basic setup. I have several planes, and as you can see, I've subdivided them a little bit just so I can use vertex painting and blend the different layers of this material together. Now I have a master material for that. As you can see, I have my texture layers and I have adjustments for all of those layers. What I've done is I've exported 4 different versions of this material. The first one, which is just basic and clean. The second one has some damage to it. The third one has even more damage to it, and the fourth one has some water spots. So now when I activate my red channel, for instance, and I turn down the strength a bit, let's say 0.1, I can actually start to paint on top of this material, or sorry, on top of this plane. And as you can see, there's some wear being generated wherever I paint. Now let's do the same thing with the green channel. As you can see, I have some cracks as well. And in the blue channel, there are some water spots too. So that way I can use several versions of this material depending on what I decide to export. And now when I have a look at this without the vertex painting mode, you can actually see that the wall itself doesn't look as boring and plain as it did before, because when I have this tiling material without any vertex painting on it, you can actually see that it looks quite repetitive and there isn't much detailing, because as I've said, I wanted this to be as plain and simple as possible. You can see some minor repetitions maybe if you look close enough, but it's a very, well, how do I put this? It's a very basic material and its look comes basically from vertex painting, and I could also add in some decals. However, in this version of my project I don't have any decals available right now, so I will just stick to the vertex painting for now. And now let's say I wanted to change something about this material, then I could go into my master material. Just ignore the folder structure, please. And as you can see, I have some global adjustments, hue, saturation, and luminosity. It changes all of the layers. And I can also change each layer individually. So let's say I just want to change the bottom layer. I mean, obviously I wouldn't want to make it blue like that. But let's say I want to make something a bit darker and some other parts a bit lighter. I could do that here. I can also change the roughness, the normal map strength, the tiling. So let's say I want the normal map of the second layer to be stronger, just so that the damage layer is more visible. I could do that here as well. So a lot of this customizability from this material comes from the Substance Designer parameters, in case I want to use this material inside of Substance Painter. And for everything else, I have a master material inside of the Unreal Engine that I can use to do everything else. Now, that's pretty much it for this segment already. And now let's go to the final conclusion of this video. That concludes the breakdown of my Substance Designer material. I really hope you enjoyed it. I really hope that you learned something from it as well. I definitely did. I learned a lot about creating parameters and the importance of making your material as customizable as possible, because sometimes you hand your material off to someone else, or maybe you want to sell it or use it in one of your own projects, and it's very important that you have some form of customizability, because you might always run into some minor issues where you have to tweak your material, and it's wasting a lot of time if you have to go back into Substance Designer, adjust the material, re-export it, and then find out that you have to tweak something else. I've also learned about the importance of organizing your graph, so that even after some time of not using it, you can still find your way around in case you want to tweak something. And I've seen a lot of Substance graphs on the internet where that isn't the case, and maybe you need to change something after a while, or maybe you get the graph from someone else and you just can't find your way around. So always keep that in mind as well. And that is pretty much it for me. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and I will see you guys next time.